Okay, and Robert is going to give us a presentation of a merge request. Please go ahead, Robert.
Cool. Do I sound all right through the AirPods, or does it sound as crap as they usually do?
It's not as brilliant as your normal, but you're certainly understandable.
I can. Well, if no one else is talking, I can turn them off. Actually, I'll ditch them and swap back to the built-in ones. Hello? Wasn't me? That's coming out all right. That's all right. Sorry, the work laptop doesn't support my proper camera and microphone setup, so I just have to use the built-in stuff, which is kind of annoying. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see this okay, or is this like weirdly tall? Otherwise it is. Cool. Okay, so this was an issue from last, oh god, how many releases ago was that? It was a few releases ago. But this one was kind of interesting in that it was actually a customer request, and I'm just going to move over to the other screen. Actually, that'll probably be easiest, and I can look at. Right, okay. Now it doesn't look like I'm just looking off into the middle of nowhere. Yeah, so there's a customer request, and I don't think it mentions which customer this is in the issue. It doesn't, which is good, because this is being recorded. So they were having an issue where anytime they were doing Git clones, it was taking forever, and they thought this was because they'd upgraded from 15.2 to 15.3. But I suspected that this wasn't the case, because when I was on a customer call with them, they just mentioned that their LDAP server is extremely slow. But then I found out that we actually don't have any logs or metrics at all in any form to say how long we're spending in LDAP requests. And it just so happened that this is only if you clone over HTTPS and not over Git, like SSH. Because if you do SSH, you use SSH keys to perform the clone, to perform the authentication. But if you do HTTPS, it requires you to sign in with your account, and their accounts are LDAP accounts. So that was my theory, but in order to prove it, I actually had to go and add LDAP logging effectively to the application. And thankfully, it actually does turn out I was right, it was LDAP, the logging worked, and it's been proven that that is actually their problem. So it's pretty cool. But to actually add it was kind of fun, because I had to use something I have actually never used in Rails before, which is this ActiveSupport notifications thing. Has anyone actually used this before? Has anyone come across this? Zilly has, yeah. I never even heard of this before. I don't know how, completely missed it. But it's an instrumentation API for Ruby. They say for Ruby, but I mean, it is part of Rails. And I think most of Rails is instrumented with this by default. Turns out that we actually do some stuff ourselves as well. And then you sort of hook into it. Thankfully, the net LDAP library supports it. So these are the adapter options for the LDAP, well, for our LDAP, I should have just loaded this up, LDAP wrapper, but it uses the net LDAP class somewhere. Oh God, hold on. No. There we go. It's a really big file. Effectively, you're using this this net LDAP library, wherever the call is for it, and there are some base options that are set up for that, and then this library is called. So net LDAP. I'll actually open up here. Has support as it turns out, in its config options, for setting an instrumentation service, and it actually supports ActiveSupport notification APIs, like they're compatible APIs. And so actually adding support in for that part of it wasn't very difficult. I'm just going to refresh this so all the other bits go away. So really all I needed to do was to add in support for that. And then it starts delivering this data. So the measurements, it uses it to measure how long things take. And it's then just available somewhere. And there wasn't really any explanation as to where you then do the other bit, where you actually subscribe to it and where you get that data, how you add it to the logs. And I eventually did figure it out, but it took quite a lot of trial and error. And it turns out we have a hierarchy here of GitLab metrics subscribers. And there's a few of these in that folder. There are a bunch of, let's see if I can find, it's a, so there's a bunch of these to add support for some other parts of it, so like view timings and stuff like that. And it hooks in and follows those ActiveSupport notification events, and then you can do what you want with them. So it turns out that this folder is effectively used for two different things. It is used for metrics, but it's also loaded into the logger. And that seems a little bit weird to me. I would have thought they'd have been separate, but I guess it kind of makes sense. So this class does both. It adds, you do have to, for every event you want to listen to, the API for this is really weird. On your subscriber, for each event you want to listen to, you have to have a public method named the same as that event name. That's a bit weird. I don't really get that. So I bodged it and aliased it for all of the events because I'm not writing out the same method 10 times. That just seems really pointless to me. Oh, sorry, was there a chat message? Yes, so the metrics do go into Kibana. So that's part of what this does. So we, for each event that happens, it calls observe event because it's alias to things. So when there's an event of open, this class gets called with the method of open with the event payload. So it logs some of the data in the request. So if there are multiple ones in the request, the times will add up. And then it exposes the metrics for Prometheus, which then ends up, no way, that's wrong, isn't it? Prometheus ends up in Prometheus/Grafana, and the logs end up in Kibana. But they're the same bits of data. I just added them to both. And that was it's a little bit weird doing them into both, but it kind of makes sense. So most of the rest of it is just about getting this data. We only really care about two things: the number of LDAP requests, which is the counter, and the duration of the LDAP requests. So the expose metrics method is where these are added to the Prometheus exporter. So this is incrementing a counter, and it's doing an observing thingy for the times. I won't go into how Prometheus works. It's weird, like it's really weird. I'm happy to go through it in the future, but it's just weird. But the logging is odd again, because this is the method that's used for logging. So none of the logging happens in this file. Instead, we have something called the instrumentation helper, which merges the fields into the logs. This is a bit of a, I'll move the videos over that way. So the instrumentation helper does a lot of things, as you can see. it does instrumentation of Gitly, it does rugged, Redis, Elasticsearch, all of these. So I just added a new method, and each one fetches this data from different places, but a lot of them do come from these metrics subscribers. So rack attacks there, for example. But then others come from other places like GitLab instrumentation classes. So I just added onto the end of it a new LDAP one, and it calls the count from that and checks that there is actually an LDAP request before it adds it to the logs. Because I did have some feedback that people didn't want to increase the log size on GitLab.com any further if there aren't LDAP requests happening. So it doesn't add any LDAP data unless something happened. And if it does, it merges it into the payload like all the rest of these do. So that's how it gets added to the logs. I think I did originally find where I think this gets loaded in. Hold on. I'm pretty certain it's in a log rage initializer. So if you've not come across log rage, it's a Ruby gem that makes the Rails logs less big. It makes them more sensible and more easily parsed. And pretty certain it's this bit at the end, and it's not doing the hovery bit. That's kind of annoying. Yeah, I'm on the wrong keyboard. Right, here we go. Yeah, so this is where all of those things get added to the payload for each log message. So this is like the start of the point for the logs. So that calls the instrumentation helper, which calls all the metrics thingies that adds all the data to the logs. And that's where it eventually gets it from. But the data is sort of collected in the background with this event emitter from ActiveSupport notifications. So you've got the ActiveSupport notifications, and then you can create these sort of subscribers and all this sort of stuff. The one thing that was really weird, I think I added some, I've added more documentation to this than in most of the other subscribers. So if you ever have to do this, this is the one to look at, because there are some really weird things in this, like the namespace for the events that get bubbled up into ActiveSupport notifications. So like the name, like the names, so net LDAP, logically that should be at the start of the key, like the event name. That's how I've always thought of a namespace. You have the namespace first, then you have like the specific event afterwards. But it's back to front, and I don't really understand why. That's a little bit weird to me. And that's not documented anywhere. That was just trial and error until I eventually found out exactly how that works. So there's a few weird things like that, and I think I've documented all of them in here. But yeah, I hopefully covered exactly what's needed in that. But I think that's it. That is ultimately is quite simple, but it did take about a week to figure out how to actually do it. Has anyone got any questions? John?
Yeah, great one to show, Robert, because as you said, like we don't normally get in there, and you're deep in the depths of GitLab, and that's quite interesting. You asked had anyone come across the ActiveSupport notifications. I've never actually worked with it, but I've looked inside a few gems, those kind of like Rollbar, those that they use it. But yeah, super interesting. And I do have one question though, is how did you test all of this?
So I had to configure LDAP locally, which you can do, and it's not too awful. I think you just basically change your GitLab config for the GDK and say enable LDAP or whatever. Then you have to reconfigure it. Then it sort of just works. They've got LDAP users installed by default. But then I had a load of problems where I couldn't actually see these log messages. And so I thought I was going insane and I'd not written it correctly. But as it turns out, the LDAP requests don't happen all the time. There's quite a lot of caching that goes on in it. And yeah, eventually I figured out that if you killed all the sessions and started it up again, you'd start seeing the log messages, but they are intermittent. Like it doesn't always re-authenticate. But yeah, so I tested it locally using that and then just hoped that it was actually the solution, because I had no evidence at all that it was actually the problem. But it was, which is nice. So. Anyone else? Yep, I did see a hand. Oh, Igor, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I have a comment rather than a question. Yeah, just this problem, yeah, looks really interesting. Yeah, I hope so. And but at the same time, it's not related to source code at all. And I'm noticed how often it happens that some particular problem. For example, starts with git push or something like this, because it's a very popular entry point, and all those issues go to our team, but then it turns out that it's not related to source code at all. So I just wanted to mention.
This was definitely one of those, like this one counted as ours because it involved a git push, but that if I could prove that it was not, if I could prove it was LDAP and it didn't, and they need further help, I can shove it onto authentication because that's technically theirs. But yeah, we've always been the team that gets all of the bits that nobody else knows if it's theirs or not. Like if there's some sort of weird issue and it's vaguely related to source code, which because it's GitLab and everything's got a repository involved, it almost inevitably does involve some code at some point. It just gets sent to us, and it always has done, like since I started. We always end up with the weird things, I think.
It's a great point, and I think you definitely took the right approach on this one, Robert. And I think had it, you know, that this could be then, as you're saying, this could be then handed off to authentication if it needed more work. But yeah, I guess part of the reason is maybe we're just a great team, but probably possibly, yeah, like the fact that we're the entry point, right? Like git push or you know, in this case HTTPS. But
yeah, I think when it came to this one, so I was on a customer call with them. They couldn't actually reproduce it on a development server, which was weird. But it was just like an offhand comment they made when they were on the call that made me suspect it. Prior to that, we had no information that they were even using LDAP. Like
wow.
It was a little bit weird, but because it's out there, like as a sort of how it works. And the difficult bit is that if it had gone to the authentication group, they'd probably have just been able to help them solve the problem. But I essentially put in an awful lot more work just so that we don't have to do future work. So it's like doing more work to do slightly less work in the future, maybe, because now people can solve this for themselves in theory. But if this hadn't been the solution, I had literally no other ideas. I had nothing planned set to come up after this, so I'm really glad that it was this. And
yeah, no, head off to you, Robert, and in fact, and also, you know, perhaps put something in chat about being an investment, because it's also an investment in your own knowledge, right? Like you got to learn how all this stuff works internally, which is a bit obscure, right?
Yeah,
the whole observability stack.
I've done stuff in the past around the Prometheus exporters. So people want like an explanation of how that works in the future. I'm happy to do that. I actually run my own Prometheus exporters at home as well. and have written my own from scratch. So that can be quite interesting. But the weird thing here was sort of figuring out how we're already setting it up, because this isn't entirely normal. Like using the same class of both logs and metrics is a little bit bizarre. But it does kind of make sense, and hopefully this class is documented well enough that people could just copy and paste it in the future, because I think that's
great. It's really great. So yeah, we're almost perfectly on time. Thank you very much, Robert. That was actually awesome. I'm going to stop the recording.